I'll never forget the sound. Not the church bells or the clink of forks on wedding china, but the cough, sharp, wet, and ugly, that tore out of my father's throat the moment my groom stood up for me. "Sir," Tyler said, steady as a man can be, "that trash outranks you." The room went still, every head turning, every breath held. My dad's wine sprayed across the white tablecloth like blood spatter in a crime scene. A lifetime of his words, trash, nothing, disgrace, caught in his throat, and for the first time in my 37 years, he didn't have a comeback. That was my wedding day in Llano, Texas. And it's where this story begins. The church fellowship hall smelled of brisket and sweet tea, the kind of scent that clings to your clothes long after you've left. Plastic tablecloths in red, white, and blue stripes. Leftovers from the church's July barbecue, covered folding tables lined up in rows. Paper plates bent under the weight of potato salad and lemon sheet cake. It wasn't a fancy wedding. It was ours. I wore a simple dress, nothing extravagant. Tyler, in his best gray suit, looked more like a mechanic on a rare Sunday than a groom, and I loved him for it. He didn't care about polish. He cared about showing up. That's when I heard it. My father's voice, low, but not low enough. Wayne Hartman never whispered in his life. He only thought he did. His words carried like a bad radio signal across the fellowship hall. "Ignore her. She's just military trash." I froze, my fork midair. The words dug into me like barbed wire. I thought maybe I'd misheard. Maybe it was the clatter of chairs or the squeak of sneakers on linoleum. But then I saw two guests in ball caps, friends of his from the HVAC shop, nodding, half smiling at the insult. My heart pounded, not from surprise, but from recognition. I'd lived with that tone, that contempt, since the day I signed up for the Texas Army National Guard at 21. In his mind, military service wasn't respectable. It was something for kids who couldn't cut it anywhere else. Never mind that I flew medevac helicopters over Afghan dust storms, bringing home wounded boys who would have bled out if we'd been 5 minutes slower. To him, it was all play acting. I clenched my jaw, ready to let it slide like I always did. Weddings aren't the place for family reckonings. Or so I thought. But Tyler had heard too. He set down his coffee cup on the table with the kind of finality that made heads turn. His shoulders straightened, and he looked square at my father. His voice carried, calm but firm, slicing through the chatter and clinking silverware. "Sir, that trash outranks you?" The fellowship hall went dead quiet. You could hear the hum of the air conditioner, the faint buzz of a fluorescent bulb overhead. My dad's face reddened as he choked on his sip of wine, coughing hard enough to stain his shirt. Guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to laugh or hide. I didn't move, didn't speak. Because in that silence, Tyler had said everything I'd swallowed for nearly 2 decades. The rest of the meal was a blur. Folks went back to eating, though quieter, with occasional glances my way. Martha, my mother, dabbed at the wine spill with church napkins, avoiding eye contact with anyone. She was good at that, quietly smoothing over her husband's rough edges. I helped carry trays into the kitchen, grateful for something to do with my hands. Tyler followed me, steady as ever. He didn't apologize for speaking up, and I didn't ask him to. "You all right?" he asked, setting down a stack of cups. I shrugged. Been worse. Truth was, my chest ached. Not from shame. I'd made my peace with Dad's disdain long ago, but from the sudden public weight of it. Folks I'd known since kindergarten, people who watched me play shortstop for the Llano Lady Jackets, had now heard the same thing I'd been hearing behind closed doors. Trash. When we stepped back into the hall, the mood had shifted. Not drastically. Folks still laughed. Kids still ran between tables. But the undercurrent had changed. People avoided my father's table. Tyler's mechanic buddies clapped him on the shoulder. A Vietnam vet named Moose Delgado gave me a nod that said more than any words could. Dad, meanwhile, sat stiff, jaw clenched, like a man who'd been shown up at his own card game. His friends avoided his eyes. I wondered then, not for the first time, What pride costs a man. Later, after the cake was cut and the last hymn hummed, I stood by the double doors, thanking guests as they filed out into the hot Texas evening. Sweat glued their shirts to their backs, and the smell of mesquite smoke drifted from a neighbor's grill down the street. My father didn't say a word as he walked past me. Didn't look at me. Just brushed by, Martha in tow, keys jangling in his calloused hand. Tyler leaned in close. He won't forget today. Neither would I. I'd carried helicopters full of wounded men through dust and fire. I'd seen fathers sob over flag-draped coffins. None of that hurt the way my father's whisper did. But sometimes, it takes a whisper to set the stage for a reckoning. And make no mistake, this was just the beginning. The morning after the wedding, I sat on the porch swing of our little house on Bluebonnet Street, a block from the Llano River. The boards creaked with each sway, cicadas drilling their endless song into the humid air. Tyler had already left for his shop in San Angelo, leaving behind the smell of diesel on his work shirt draped over a chair. I sipped burnt coffee from a chipped mug, staring at the neighborhood I'd known my whole life. Old Mrs. Gonzalez, across the street, was watering her roses. Kids rode bikes with plastic streamers on the handlebars. To anyone else, it was an ordinary Texas morning. To me, it was heavy, my father's whisper still clanging in my head. Ignore her, she's just military trash. That sentence had lived with me since I was 21, the day I raised my right hand and swore into the Texas Army National Guard. Dad shook his head back then, said I'd regret it, said the Guard was for kids without a plan. I had a plan, always did. I started as an EMT, riding in an ambulance out of Burnett County. I loved the work, loved the quiet moments after a save, when a stranger would grip my wrist with gratitude too deep for words. But I wanted more. The Guard gave me that. I went to flight school, earned my bars, and ended up in the cockpit of a UH-60 Black Hawk, the big bird that carried hope when everything else looked hopeless. Helmand Province, 2014. That place still lingers in the corners of my memory. Dust thick enough to choke you. Heat that warped the horizon. I was piloting command on a medevac when we got the call. Troops pinned down, multiple casualties. We dropped fast and hot. Tyler was there, then a crew chief with grease up to his elbows, eyes bloodshot from weeks in country. He was one of the wounded that day. Shrapnel caught him along the side. I remember the way he looked at me, pale but stubborn, trying to stand when his legs wouldn't listen. "Stay down, Sergeant," I'd ordered. "I've got you." We lifted out under fire. I flew low, skimming over mud compounds and dry riverbeds, every nerve alive. When we landed, I kept my hand on his shoulder the whole time, steadying his breathing until the medics took him. He told me later, at a VFW fish fry, that he never forgot that touch. Said it was the reason he asked me to marry him years after. Funny how life circles back like that. Dad never saw that part. He only saw uniforms and medals as playthings. He thought real work was sweating under an AC unit in August, or balancing a checkbook at the kitchen table. To him, service didn't pay the bills, so it didn't count. I think about the weight Mom carried in silence. Martha Hartman has never worn a uniform, but she has stitched more patches and name tapes than anyone. After my deployments, she'd take my old fatigues and cut them into squares for church quilts. She'd smile, call it recycling. But I knew what she was really doing, turning memory into something warm. "Your daddy doesn't mean half what he says," she told me once, while folding towels in the laundry room. "He means every word," I answered. She didn't argue, just set the towel on the pile and patted my arm. I drove out to the shop later that week to bring Tyler lunch. His place, Reed Diesel and Tractor Repair, sat off Highway 67, a corrugated metal building with grease stains on the concrete and an old Coke machine out front that hadn't worked in years. Tyler was under a combine, hands black with oil. Country radio drifted from a battered boombox, half static. He slid out, wiped his face with a rag, and grinned. "You didn't have to drive all this way." "I wanted to," I said, holding up a bag from Cooper's old-time pit BBQ. Brisket sandwiches. We ate on overturned buckets in the shade, flies buzzing around. He didn't mention Dad. Neither did I at first. But eventually, the silence was too loud. He'll never respect what I do, I admitted. Tyler chewed, thoughtful. Respect ain't a medal you pin on. It's earned every day. You know that better than anyone. I don't need his respect. Maybe not, but you deserve it. I looked at him. This man who once bled in my helicopter, who now rebuilt tractors for ranchers that needed every blade of grass cut. He didn't speak in fancy terms, but his words held weight. Back home, I found Mom in the garden, her hands in the soil, pulling weeds around her tomato plants. He's been in the garage all afternoon, she said without looking up, grumbling. I'm not surprised. You embarrassed him, Emily. I laughed sharp. I didn't say a word. That's what embarrassed him, she answered softly. Tyler did, and you let him. Her words stung, but they were true. My silence had been an agreement, a quiet nod to the truth I'd never dare speak out loud. I wiped my face with my sleeve, the sweat mixing with something saltier. Service looks like a lot of things. Sometimes it's flying a helicopter through dust and fire. Sometimes it's biting your tongue so you don't rip apart your own family in public. And sometimes it's letting someone else, someone who loves you, speak the words you've been carrying too long. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling fans spinning slow in the dark. Tyler's hand rested on my stomach, steady, warm. You think he'll ever come around? I whispered. Tyler didn't open his eyes. Doesn't matter if he does. The truth's already out there. I closed my eyes, listening to the hum of the fan, the creak of the old house, the steady rhythm of Tyler's breathing. The truth was out there, and it was only the beginning. If you really want to know where Tyler and I first started to understand each other, it wasn't at some candlelit dinner or fancy event. It was standing under the humming fluorescence of VFW Post 4869 in Llano, Texas, our elbows deep in fryer grease. It was late spring, a few months before the wedding. The Post was hosting its annual fish fry fundraiser. The whole building smelled of cornmeal batter and hot oil. Men in unit ball caps shuffled around with styrofoam trays, and the ladies' auxiliary kept the coleslaw coming from gallon tubs. You could hear the clink of beer bottles on folding tables, country music low on the jukebox, and the steady rattle of the old ice machine that never worked quite right. That's where Moose Delgado held court. Folks called him Moose because he was big and slow-moving, like the animal. 78 years old, Vietnam vet, legs stiff from shrapnel but eyes sharp as ever. He was the kind of man who didn't waste words. When he nodded, you felt it. Tyler had been helping him unload coolers of catfish when I walked in wearing my guard ball cap. A couple of old-timers gave me the up and down, respectful but quiet. Moose just said, "Pilot, huh?" "Yes, sir," I answered. He nodded, turned back to the fryer, and didn't ask another question. That was Moose. Respect wasn't loud with him. It just was. Tyler, grease on his arms, smiled at me. "You still owe me a story." "What story?" I asked. "The one about Helmand. You never finished." I shrugged. Not much to tell. Dust, heat, and a helicopter that barely wanted to fly. "You flew it anyway," he said, matter of fact. And that's when I knew Tyler remembered every second of that day. He didn't need me to embellish it. Fast forward to a week before the wedding. Same post, different night. This time, it was our rehearsal dinner. We'd pushed aside the long tables, hung up a few streamers, and let the auxiliary ladies lay out casseroles and sheet cakes. Dad showed up in his pressed polo, the one with Hartman Air and Heat embroidered on the chest. He shook a few hands, slapped backs, played the part of a proud father for about 10 minutes. Then the cracks showed. I was talking with one of Tyler's army buddies when I heard Dad's laugh from across the room. Loud, sharp, carrying over the music. "Nice costumes you all got there," he said, nodding at their service dress. "Toy medals too. Almost looks real." The table went quiet. You could have heard a fork drop. One of the guys shifted uncomfortably, looking at Tyler. But Tyler didn't flinch. He just put his hand over mine under the table, a quiet anchor. I wanted to say something. My mouth even opened. But then Moose spoke up from his chair, near the raffle board. Some men, he said, slow and gravelly, can't hear over their own echo. The whole room froze. Nobody argued with Moose. Dad chuckled awkwardly and turned away, pretending he hadn't heard, but everybody had. Later that night, after folks had gone home and we were stacking chairs, Tyler pulled me aside. His voice was low, but steady. You don't have to carry this alone anymore, he said. Carry what? I asked, even though I knew. His words, his pride, the way he makes you feel small. You don't have to keep swallowing it. I leaned against the wall, tired to the bone. What choice do I have? He's my dad. Tyler wiped his hands on a rag, leaving dark smudges. You don't have to like him to love him, but you don't have to let him run you down either. It was the first time someone had drawn that line for me. Not disrespecting my father, not picking a fight, just setting a boundary that should have been there all along. When we got home, Mom called. She always checked in after events like that, like a medic assessing damage. Your daddy just doesn't know how to joke right, she said gently. Mom, those aren't jokes. She sighed. I know. There was a pause, long and heavy. I could hear her folding laundry in the background, the soft slap of towels. He'll come around, she offered. But I didn't believe it, not anymore. The week dragged. Tyler stayed busy at the shop, tinkering with tractors and old Fords. I spent evenings at home, polishing boots out of habit, even though I wasn't deploying anywhere. Old habits die slow. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Dad at that VFW hall, smirking while men who'd bled for this country looked at their plates in silence. And I kept hearing Moose's words. Some men can't hear over their own echo. That night, I promised myself I wouldn't let his echo drown me out anymore. The line in the sand had been drawn, and the wedding itself was about to put it to the test. The Monday after the wedding, I drove over to Marble Falls, where my dad's HVAC shop sat just off Highway 281. Hartman Air and Heat had been there since I was a kid. The place always smelled of Freon, coil cleaner, and dust from old ductwork. The radio inside was stuck on classic rock, ZZ Top or Creedence on endless repeat. I walked in and found him hunched over a desk cluttered with invoices and dog-eared manuals. He didn't look up. You embarrassed me, he said flatly. I set my hands on the counter, steady. I didn't say a word, Dad. He slammed the stapler down. That boy of yours made me look like a fool. I swallowed hard. He stood up for me. That's what husbands are supposed to do. Dad finally looked at me, his jaw tight, his face red from more than the Texas heat. You should have shut it down. You let him talk to me like that in front of everyone. I thought about Moose's quiet rebuke, about the way folks had stared at their plates. I thought about Tyler's hand slipping into mine, anchoring me, and I thought about the wine stains on Dad's shirt. I'm not responsible for your pride, I said. He muttered something under his breath and turned back to his papers, ending the conversation. By that afternoon, the story was already rolling through town. Llano's a small place. You can't cough without someone knowing. Folks at the diner whispered over chicken fried steak. At the feed store, I overheard a rancher's wife say, "It's a shame what he said about her." Some leaned toward me with sympathy. Others looked away, embarrassed for me. I'd been home a dozen times from deployments, but never had I felt so on display. Mom called me that night. Her voice was tired, like she'd been carrying buckets all day. He's stewing, she said. Won't talk about it, but I can tell. Let him stew, I answered. Emily. She paused, then added, Don't give up on him. He's a proud man, but he's still your daddy. I didn't answer, because I didn't know if being my daddy was enough anymore. Tyler tried to mend things in his way. A few days later, he invited Dad for lunch at Cooper's old Time Pit BBQ, the kind of place where the smoke clinks to your clothes and the brisket drips with fat. Tyler sat at a corner table waiting. Dad never showed. When Tyler came home, he didn't complain. He just shrugged, kicked off his boots, and started fixing the leaky faucet in our kitchen. That's who he was. If something broke, he fixed it, even when the break wasn't his fault. Then the VFW called, Moose himself. "Emily," he said, voice raspy from years of smoke and age, "the committee wants you as Grand Marshal for the 4th of July parade." I laughed, short and bitter. "Not a chance, Moose. I'm not looking for more attention." "It's not about attention," he told me. "It's about truth. Folks need to see who you are." I shook my head. "No, I fly helicopters. I come home, I mind my business. That's enough." But word traveled fast. By the end of the week, half the town knew I'd been asked. And my father, well, he wasn't about to let it slide. He showed up at a city councilman's office, complaining that naming me Grand Marshal was political. Said it would turn the parade into a recruiting ad. When Mom told me, I felt that old ache in my chest. He wasn't just embarrassing me in private anymore. He was dragging my name through public halls. "You going to fight him on it?" Tyler asked one night as we sat on the porch, listening to the crickets. "No," I said. "I'm not giving him another show." Tyler leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Emily, there's a difference between a show and standing your ground." I stared out at the quiet street, the street I'd ridden bikes down as a kid, the street where Dad once taught me how to throw a baseball. I wasn't sure where that line was anymore. A week later, Moose cornered me again, this time outside the grocery store. He was leaning on his cane, holding a sack of onions. "You keep turning down recognition, folks are going to think you're ashamed of what you did," he said. "I'm not ashamed." "Then quit acting like it." His words hit harder than he probably intended, because deep down, I wasn't hiding from recognition. I was hiding from my father's judgment. That night, I asked Mom straight out, "Do you think he'll ever be proud of me?" She hesitated too long. "He's set in his ways, Emily, but pride looks different for different men." I wanted to believe her, but in my gut, I knew the only pride Dad carried was his own. The 4th of July was closing in. Banners already hung on Main Street. Kids practiced with the high school drumline in the church parking lot. The whole town was buzzing with anticipation. And me? I was caught in the fallout of one whispered sentence at my own wedding. My father's words had lit a fuse, and sooner or later, something was going to explode. The Llano County Courthouse sits in the middle of the square like a weathered sentinel. Old stone walls, a clock tower that doesn't always tell the right time, bronze plaques remembering wars most folks only read about in history books. I'd walked those steps 100 times as a kid. Easter egg hunts, Christmas lighting, county fairs. Never thought I'd be the subject of discussion inside. It was late June, just a week and change before the 4th. The city council had called a working session to finalize parade details. My name was on the agenda, though I never asked for it. Word was, Dad had stirred up enough fuss that they decided to put it to a vote. I slipped into the back of the courtroom, trying to disappear into the wooden benches. The air smelled faintly of floor wax and old paper. Ceiling fans ticked above, pushing warm air around. Folks filled the rows. Ranchers in pearl snap shirts. Teachers on summer break. Veterans in caps embroidered with ships and units. My stomach twisted. Dad was already there, sitting up front in his pressed polo, legs crossed, arms folded. He looked like a man ready for a fight. Mom sat beside him, hands clasped in her lap, her face a careful mask. Judge Mary Collins, silver-haired and steady, banged the gavel. "We're here to finalize the parade marshal decision. I ask for civility. This is a community event." A councilwoman introduced me by name, rattling off my service record in plain language. 2 tours, medevac pilot, currently with the Texas Army National Guard. Nothing dramatic, just the facts. My ears burned anyway. That's when Dad stood. "With respect, this parade is for the town, not the military. Making my daughter Grand Marshal turns it into a recruiting commercial. Folks don't need politics shoved in their faces on the 4th of July." A murmur rolled through the room. I gripped the bench, fighting the urge to speak. Then Janice Cooper, who ran the feed store and chaired the parade committee, rose from her seat. Wayne, we've honored teachers, EMTs, even Coach Brown last year. Emily's service is part of this community. It ain't politics. It's recognition. Dad shook his head. Flying a helicopter overseas doesn't mean she deserves to ride down Main Street like a queen. That stung, more than I wanted to admit. Tyler was there too. He stood, tugged at his sleeve, and spoke plain. I was on the ground the day she flew into Helmand. I'd taken shrapnel. Couldn't breathe right. She landed that bird under fire, got me out alive. I'm married today because she brought me home. If that's not worth honoring, I don't know what is. Silence fell for a long moment. Then Moose rose, leaning heavy on his cane. He held a folded sheet of paper in one hand, voice shaking but firm. I've got a letter here from Jim and Carol Duncan. Lost their boy in Afghanistan. They asked me to read it since they couldn't be here. It says, Captain Hartman flew our son's friend home after an IED strike. He said Emily's voice on that headset was the only thing that kept him calm. We can't bring our boy back, but we want to thank the pilot who saved another family from our pain. The words echoed off stone walls. I looked down at my boots, blinking fast. Dad muttered, It's just flying a bird. That's when Mrs. Evelyn Parker, who'd driven the school bus in town for 30 years, stood up. She taught my granddaughter to breathe slow and count to 10 after the tornado, Wayne. She didn't wear a helmet that day, just sat with her till the panic passed. That's not politics. That's service. Heads nodded. People shifted, murmuring agreement. Judge Collins tapped her gavel lightly. This is not about politics. It's about contribution, and Captain Hartman has contributed. She looked across the room, her eyes landing on me. Ma'am, do you accept the role? I wanted to say no. Every bone in my body wanted to hide, to shrink back into the bench and let the moment pass. But then I caught sight of Mom's face, tight, tired, but hopeful. And behind her, a row of high school girls in softball jerseys, whispering to each other, eyes wide. I stood, legs shaky. If the community wants me, I'll do it. Not for myself, for those who served with me, and for the girls coming up behind me. The applause started small, then grew until it filled the hall. Folks stood, clapping, nodding. Even Tyler's grease-stained buddies from the shop had made the drive, and they hollered like it was a Friday night football game. Dad stayed seated, arms crossed, face hard. But for once, it didn't matter. Afterward, outside on the courthouse steps, Moose shuffled up beside me. You did right, kid. Some truth's gotta be spoken where folks can hear. I nodded, swallowing past the lump in my throat. He'll never forgive me for this. Moose chuckled, dry as dust. He might not, but he'll never forget either. That's something. I looked back at the courthouse, the Texas flag flapping in the hot breeze, and thought about the line I'd crossed. I hadn't wanted this fight, but it was here now, and there was no going back. The truth was out in the open, and the 4th of July parade was coming fast. The morning of the 4th of July broke hot and heavy, the kind of Texas heat that made flags hang limp before noon. Main Street was already lined with lawn chairs and coolers, kids darting between legs with snow cones that dripped down their arms. The smell of grilled sausage and sunscreen mixed in the air. I sat in the back of a borrowed '72 Ford F-100, tailgate down, knees together, palms damp. A hand-painted sign on the truck read, Capt. Emily Hartman, Medical Evacuation Pilot, Texas Army National Guard. The high school band started up at the end of the street, a ragged drumline beating out a cadence that bounced off the storefronts. I felt every eye turn my way. The MC, Dale Patterson, leaned into a microphone hooked to a crackling PA system. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your 2025 Grand Marshal, Captain Emily Hartman of Llano, Texas. 2 tours as a medevac pilot, bringing our boys home safe. His voice was steady, not showy, just facts. Folks clapped, Some hollered. Veterans in unit caps rose to their feet, saluting. I nodded, small, not waving like a queen, but acknowledging them. That's when I saw Dad. He was in the front row of lawn chairs, arms crossed, jaw clenched. Mom sat beside him, hands folded in her lap. He looked like a man bracing for a storm. Halfway down Main Street, the parade paused while the band regrouped. Tyler, walking nearby, leaned toward Dale, whispered something, then stepped forward to the microphone. My heart caught in my throat. He cleared his voice, speaking plain, steady. Most of you know me as the guy who fixes your tractors. What you don't know is that 10 years ago, in Helmand Province, I thought I wasn't coming home. Shrapnel hit me. Couldn't breathe. I thought I was done. He pointed toward me in the truck bed. That woman flew a Black Hawk through dust and fire, landed under gunfire, and pulled me out. She kept her hand on my shoulder until I could breathe again. I'm standing here today, alive, married, grateful, because Captain Hartman didn't leave me behind. The crowd went quiet. Even the kids stilled. Tyler's voice carried down the street, firm as a church bell. Then he turned his gaze on my father. Sir, she outranks me, and she outranks the part of you that can't say, I'm proud of you. Gas rippled through the crowd. Some folks looked at Dad, others at me. My father's face flushed red, his jaw working like he wanted to spit a retort but couldn't find words. The silence broke when Moose Delgado, leaning heavy on his cane, rose from his folding chair. He saluted me, slow and deliberate. Then another vet stood. Then the high school band director. Then a dozen folks. Applause rolling down Main like thunder. Flags waved, people clapped, some shouted my name. I felt my throat tighten. For once, the recognition didn't feel heavy. It felt shared. Like the weight of service was finally seen, not just carried in the dark. Dad stayed seated at first, arms locked across his chest. Mom leaned toward him, murmuring something only he heard. Still he sat, stubborn. That's when Judge Collins, sitting 2 rows back, stepped forward. She put a hand on his shoulder and said, clear enough for folks nearby to hear, Wayne, you want to be the last man sitting? The words hit harder than any sermon. Dad hesitated. Then slowly, awkwardly, he stood. His claps were stiff, reluctant, but they were claps all the same. And for the first time in my life, I saw him wipe his face with the back of his hand, hiding what he couldn't say. I didn't wave or bow. I simply lifted 2 fingers from my knee in a small salute, acknowledging the crowd, the vets, even him. No victory lap, no grand gesture. Just quiet recognition. The drumline started up again. The parade moved on. But the moment stayed. Like a bell you can still hear long after it's rung. That day on Main Street, something shifted. The town saw me not as military trash, but as one of their own who had carried her share of weight. And my father, well, he couldn't unhear the truth anymore. The parade ended the way small-town parades always do. Kids chasing candy wrappers down the street, parents folding lawn chairs, old men arguing about whose brisket was better at last year's cook-off. The sun beat down on Main Street until the asphalt shimmered. But the moment, the one where my father stood, clapping with a wet shine in his eyes, stayed with me long after the drums quieted. That afternoon, we gathered at VFW Post 4869 for the potluck. Crockpots lined the long table, bubbling with chili and green beans. Someone had brought a sheet cake with, "Thank you, Captain Hartman," iced in red, white, and blue letters. Kids played cornhole out back, their laughter mixing with the hum of cicadas. I was ladling sweet tea into plastic cups when I saw him. My dad, standing by the coffee urn, shifting from one foot to the other. He looked smaller than usual, like the heat had worn him down. "Got a minute?" he asked. I set the ladle aside and followed him to a quiet corner near the wall of old unit photos. He cleared his throat. I didn't mean half of what I said." I raised an eyebrow. "You meant every word." He rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding my eyes. I've been loud my whole life. Figured if I barked enough, folks would listen. Didn't notice who was doing the heavy lifting. It wasn't an apology, not fully, but it was closer than I'd ever heard. Respect isn't confetti you throw on holidays, I said quietly. It's every day. It's showing up, not just when there's a crowd watching. He nodded, eyes fixed on the scuffed floor. I don't know how to fix what I broke. You start with Mom, I told him. She's carried more of your weight than you realize. And then you show up next month at the blood drive. No excuses. His mouth twitched, like he wanted to argue, but then he nodded again. Fair enough. Later, as the potluck wound down, Tyler pulled me onto the small patch of tile cleared for dancing. Someone had propped a phone on the jukebox, playing Stand By Me. We swayed slow, the smell of fried chicken and coffee in the air. Moose sat at a table with a paper plate of deviled eggs, grinning like a man who'd seen enough fireworks in one lifetime. Across the hall, Dad folded chairs without being asked. He carried trash bags out to the dumpster, even took one from a teenage volunteer and tied the knot himself. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't public, it was work. And maybe that was the beginning of respect. The kind you show with your hands, not your mouth. Driving home that night, windows down, the warm wind whipping through my hair, I thought about the weight of the past weeks. My father's whisper, Tyler's stand, the courthouse debate, the parade. Each moment had carved something deeper into me. Honor isn't loud. It isn't medals or titles or parades. It's steady. It's showing up when folks aren't looking. It's holding someone's shoulder when they can't breathe, or folding chairs when nobody asks. I don't know if my dad and I will ever see eye to eye. Maybe pride runs too deep. Maybe old habits don't break clean. But I know this. He can't unsee what happened on Main Street. He can't unhear Tyler's words. And he can't undo the way the town stood that day. Sometimes revenge isn't about shouting louder. Sometimes it's about standing still until the truth does the work for you. To anyone listening, maybe you've carried words like trash, nothing, disgrace for too long. Maybe they came from someone you love. Maybe they still echo. Don't let that echo drown you out. Speak your truth where folks can hear it, or let someone who loves you speak it for you. And when the moment comes, because it will, stand steady. Because honor has a way of showing itself, whether the world is ready or not. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you'd like more stories like this. Stories about everyday Americans, carrying quiet weight, and finding their voice. And tonight, when you set down your cup or fold a chair, remember, respect isn't loud. It's what you do when nobody's watching.